I would say in Ohio, where we would tend to be more religiously slanted than other states, I would say that in Ohio, among the science community, that view is the dominant view of any of them. That there are more people, scientists in Ohio, who would agree with this answer than would agree with either non-belief or belief of a divine God. Now that is not formal, I don't have data to back that up, but it's an interesting observation that I've made and a pattern that I've seen emerge through my studies so far. Next slide. So, we're going to get to the point, and that is, whenever this conversation happens, without fail, every single time I've had this conversation, the first question out of people's, it goes like this. Oh, you're a Christian? Yeah. So you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old? No. And then the conversation proceeds from there. And what that's getting at is this question here, which is really, in many ways, the most important question we're going to ask tonight, which is modern cosmology and evolution, so the story, scientifically, of how we got on this planet and how the universe was created, is that reconcilable with the creation story given in Genesis? So to run through the important dates of cosmology and evolution, you have the Big Bang Theory 13.8 billion years ago. Don't get hung up on what the Big Bang Theory was. I will explain more about what it actually was to our current understanding later. But that occurred 13.8 billion years ago. The Sun formed 5 billion years ago. Earth, 500 million years after that. The first living thing that we have evidence of in fossils was 3.8 billion years ago. First animals on the planet, 750 million years ago, emerging specifically in Earth's oceans. That's important for reasons you will see later. We have the first mammals 200 million years ago, and modern humans, meaning the last major change in our DNA occurred that we can measure about 200,000 years ago. And we've been largely the same on a genealogy level since. Next slide. So, is this reconcilable with Genesis? Well, there are two ways you can interpret Genesis typically. One is through the fundamental, literal way. And the answer to that is no, they're not reconcilable. They're only reconcilable through one method of one approach. And it's one that I do not agree with, and I'll tell you why now. The literal reading of Genesis supposes that the word day in Genesis is translated literally as it being a 24-hour day. Now, if you read that as literal, that's understandable. The Hebrew word that is used is yom, which does translate literally to day. However, it's also used elsewhere in biblical passages in conjunction with other words to show the change of time. We also have to keep in mind the Bible is not a completely literal document. The Bible is a collection of different types of writing. You would be, incorrect to read Psalms as being literal, or Revelation to be literal, or the parables Jesus tells as being literal. So to say that something in the Bible is not strictly literally what it means is, I understand why people get uneasy when I say that, but to me it is not only not inappropriate, but it is the appropriate approach at certain times. The only way you can reconcile 6-day or 7-day creation with the modern scientific understanding of how we got here is if you subscribe to what we refer to as the young Earth theory. This has several names of it. You may have recognized the idea of the theory. You don't recognize it under that terminology. It's been called several things. The idea with that is that God would have created more as an artist than a scientist. And so God would have intentionally created Earth and the universe to appear older than it actually is. And my problem with that is that, to me, that paints a picture of God's character that I'm uncomfortable with. If we understand God to be an all-powerful and all-good God, and we also understand that we are made in His image, and so the things that we believe to be good about ourselves, like a sense of scientific curiosity or artistic expression, then I believe those are good qualities that people have. I believe most people believe that. Then we have to believe those comes from God. And I find it hard to reconcile an idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God with a God that would have intentionally deceived people in the future by creating the world and universe to appear older than it actually is. Now, that is not to say that you can't believe that. Plenty of people do. If that is your interpretation of Genesis, that is your interpretation of Genesis. I do not agree, but plenty of people would with you. And by all means, if you're having this conversation with someone and they ask you about it, be honest and convicted in your faith and approach this conversation appropriately. I will say that if you do answer yes to that question, do you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, don't expect the conversation to continue afterwards, because chances are you're going to get laughed at and then walk away. Again, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm simply stating that as a fact that I have seen happen while this conversation occurred. Next slide. All right, so if we don't interpret it as being literal, 24-hour day, then how do we interpret it? If we, again, use this word yom and look elsewhere in the Bible, just elsewhere in Genesis, we don't even have to go far, we see it used as follows. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and when summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. That word day is the word yom. This passage is discussing the passage of time as long as earth exists. That's the idea behind this word remaineth. And so here we see day and night, or day, used in a passage that is explicitly describing a longer passage of time than a 24-hour day. Genesis 2:4, we have these are the generations of the heavens and of the earth. They are created in the day of the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. The same thing, we have a juxtaposition of the word day with generations showing a longer term passage of time than a 24-hour day. And finally, the biggest problem I have with the literal interpretation of day is that if you read Genesis, the sun is created on the 4th day of creation. Well, that's a problem with the literal interpretation because we define a day as being the time it takes for Earth to rotate once on its axis, therefore the sun going once across the sky. And since the ancients didn't understand that the Earth was rotating on its axis, their understanding of a day was marked by the passing of the sun in the sky. We don't have the sun until day 4. I have a big problem with defining the first 3 days of Genesis as being 24 literal hours. Next slide.
Jacob, can I hold you there?
Yeah.
I do want to point that out because the opening passage says, Quebec?
Yeah.
That 2:4. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord created them. If you actually are attempting to use literal day, Genesis 2:4 actually contradicts chapter 1. Because Genesis says it was only, that verse seems to make it sound like it was one day. In Genesis 1, this is actually pressed so hard that some theologians have said that they were two separate accounts because of this.
Right.
But the obvious reconciliation of it is to recognize that the word day is being used in a poetic way.
Right.
But so the literal problem, the literal day problem really forms itself theologically before it does scientifically.
Right.
Because if you hold it, you have to make a contradiction in the first 2 chapters of the Bible.
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure we really drove that home because it's important.
Yeah.
Great work. Keep going.
Yeah. Can I get water, by the way?
Nope.
Awesome, thank you. All right, next slide. All right, so how do we reconcile the two then? Well, there are actually a lot of commonalities between the Genesis account and what we are understanding to be true scientifically. For example, our current understanding of the Big Bang is that the entire universe, as it is now, was, or not as it is now, but the universe that is now, was compressed into something smaller than the size of the atom. And that essentially on the quantum level, there were some fluctuations that occurred that we don't fully understand, and I haven't fully defined yet, and that caused a rapid expansion of the universe. And this happened 13.8 billion years ago. Well, for the beginning part of that expansion, the universe would have been so hot that matter could not form. It was too hot for atoms to actually condense and form, and so for the first several hundred million years of the universe, it would have been completely radiation or light filled. Well, in Genesis 1, we have the first day. The first thing that happens is God says, let there be light, and there is light, and then he separates the waters, which is important because our understanding of the formation of Earth is that Earth first would have been molten as all these rocks and space debris are colliding with each other and starting to form the Earth. And then once the crust had cooled enough that it wasn't molten anymore, the water would have been on Earth before the land. That is our current understanding of how Earth formed. Water is on Earth in Genesis before land as well, before God separates it from the sea. We also, in both accounts, have life beginning in the oceans. In current evolutionary theory, the oceans are a primordial soup where we have better conditions for life because the oceans are more stable than the land. Earth at this time is still a very violent place on a climate level, and the oceans provide, specifically deep in the oceans, provide some refuge from the chaos happening higher up on the surface. And so we believe strongly that life would have occurred first in the oceans, which is exactly what happens in Genesis. Life then moves and transitions to land. You would have had fish creatures first before the idea is that reptiles would have come along, things that could tolerate being in water and in land in these intercoastal areas. And then quickly at the same time, birds would have been evolving as well. In Genesis, we have fish in the oceans, and then we immediately after that have the first creatures on land and birds at the same time simultaneously. Before, on the next day, you have, day 5, you have mammals on land, and then humans, of course, coming last in both chains of both chain of those events. All right, so that's not bad actually. That's way more in common than you may think the two have, but there's still one glaring issue, and that is on the next slide. The fourth day. The fourth day in Genesis is when the sun and stars and moon are all created. And it says that God created the light to govern the day, the one to govern the night. He called the one during the day the sun, he called the one at night the moon. And this presents an issue because we know that the sun is older than the earth. We have very reliable dating techniques. We understand this. Those dates I gave earlier, the 5 billion and 4.5 billion years are rock solid dates. So the problem here is that obviously the sun would have come first. The moon, as we currently understand it, formed when very early on when Earth was forming. Earth would have been a little smaller than it is now, and something about the size of Mars, which is about 2/3 the size of Earth, would have crashed into it. We call that object Theia. It would have crashed into the Earth, shearing off the outer crust of the Earth at that time, completely destroying Theia, which would have created a giant ring around the Earth briefly, and then the moon coalesced out of that debris very quickly. And that would have happened all within a few 100,000 years, which is actually a shockingly short amount of time in terms of astronomy. It's also actually a really interesting paper that came out last month that says the moon might have actually formed in as little as a year, which would be mind-blowing in many ways. But yeah, anyway, fun times. The stars in the sky are even a bigger problem because we don't have a date for every star in the sky, obviously, especially 4.5 billion years ago when the Earth would have formed. But stars live anywhere between a few 100 million years to several billion years. And so to say that all the stars were created at one time or that they were all created after the Earth is a problem. You also have the problem with how light travels from these things. So when you look at a star, all of them are really, really far away. So far away, in fact, that you are not actually seeing them as they exist. Because the speed of light is 300,000 kilometers a second. To put that into perspective, snap your fingers. Okay, light, thank you. Light just traveled around the planet 7 times. Okay, light is fast enough to travel around the planet 7 times in 1 second. That gives you an idea. It takes 8 minutes for light to go from the sun to Earth. So the sun blew up right now, we wouldn't know it for 8 minutes, and then we still wouldn't know because we'd all be dead. So, when you look at stars, so take our closest stellar neighbor. You can't see the northern hemisphere, it's a southern hemisphere star. Its name is Alpha Centauri. I'll come back to it later on in the presentation as well. But it is our closest neighbor, and it is about 4.5 light years away, which means that's the distance we use in astronomy to measure distance between things, the light year. And that is a distance that light travels in a year, going at 300,000 kilometers a second. So if you look at Alpha Centauri right now, you're not seeing it as it was in 2023. You're seeing it as it was in 2019. And it blew up right now. We wouldn't know it until 2027. And then we'd all flock to the southern hemisphere to see it, because that would be awesome. But we see stars in the night sky that are hundreds and thousands of light years away. And so, again, problematic. Now, the solution to this problem is one that, to be perfectly honest, is the most uncomfortable portion of reconciliation for me. And that is the idea that Genesis is written from a human perspective, which makes sense to a degree. And that we do have an understanding scientifically that Earth's atmosphere, because of the violent nature of Earth's formation, Earth's atmosphere actually would not have become completely transparent until about 2.5 billion years ago, about 2 billion years fully after it first formed. So, if you're on the planet that was the first time that you would actually be able to see the sun, the moon, and the stars. That is the typical reconciliation given for this topic. It is one that I am inclined to believe, as I do not have a better reconciliation for the idea, although again, to be perfectly honest, and a night-centered, honest conversation, this is the part of reconciling Genesis with modern understanding of science that I am the most uncomfortable with. Next slide. All right, so from there, we have an opportunity to dive into all of these topics later. Again, this first part of the night is just designed for me to give some groundwork for the evening. But there are several main scientific questions we have in the scientific account of creation. In fact, I could do a whole other 2-hour presentation on just these alone. But to hit the highlights, what was the first living thing? We do not know what that thing was. The first living thing that we have evidence of was that 3.8 billion years ago. That does not mean it was the first living thing, though. Our current understanding would be that as you might suspect, single-celled organisms would have evolved first. This would have been something that we would consider a plant, or similar to a single-celled plant organism. Plants, multi-cell plants, would have evolved after that, animals after that, and so on and so forth to more complex things. We do not know what that first living thing was, and more crucially, we do not understand how you go from non-living components to living components. We do not have an understanding of how that would happen. Now, for those of you who are biology people, the current explanation, as I understand it, I am not a biology person, but my current understanding of the idea at the moment is that we would assemble non-living parts and assemble something looking like a virus, which, again, for those of you who are in high school biology class, can be considered both alive and not alive because it doesn't have all 7 characteristics needed to be considered living, and then that virus-type object would have then progressed to the single-cell organism that would be the first living thing. All of that is still an idea, and true of the matter is that we really don't know what that first living thing was or how it formed. Other problem, intermediates. What do I mean by that? I mean that if the biggest gaps in the fossil record, as far as we can tell, are those intermediary steps between species. How do we get from fish to birds? Now, that does not mean that those fossils and that evidence does not exist. I want to make that clear. It just means that we do not currently have a full understanding of how those transitions occur. And some of you might have the phrase "God of the gaps" in your mind right now, and don't worry, we'll be addressing that in detail later on. Another one, timescale evolution. Some people have done calculations on the current evolution timescale and have come up with a response saying that there is simply not enough time passed on the planet for life to have evolved in the way it has with all its diverse ways with the age of the planet. The Earth would simply be much older for the diversity of life found on the planet to be on the planet, and the timescales simply do not work out. And then finally, if, as evolution suggests, the things that are non-critical for life evolve out of your DNA, because survival of the fittest, natural selection, evolution, that idea, then a lot of living things, including humans, have an awful lot of junk DNA floating around. So about 10% of your DNA is garbage. It doesn't do anything. It is simply placeholder.